Hey, Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I was wondering, as we start off, could you describe what it might have been like for the soldiers there in the tense weeks and days leading up to the siege at Yorktown?
Really, on New Year's Eve of 1780, Benedict Arnold landed in Hampton and started conducting raids throughout Virginia. And that set the stage for the events leading into Yorktown as Washington sent his protege and probably his surrogate son, the Marquis de Lafayette, to Virginia to counter Arnold at first and later to counter Cornwallis.
And speaking of Cornwallis, as we look to the British side of things, why did British General Cornwallis even choose Yorktown?
As we get to Yorktown in the fall, there's a couple huge battles culminating with the Battle of Eutaw Springs in September of 1780 in South Carolina. Cornwallis starts to run out of supplies, and he's got to head back east. He heads towards Portsmouth, where he gets a message from General Clinton saying, we need to secure a deep water port. And Portsmouth couldn't do that. You couldn't get ships of the line up the river into Portsmouth. So Cornwallis did exactly what he was supposed to do, and he was familiar with Yorktown. Yorktown was the largest seaport between New York City and Savannah. It was a deep water port, and it had everything that the British wanted, and it was very defensible if only the British had done it in the right way, which they didn't.
And with that, I don't think a lot of people realize that this war was truly a world war. So how did the other battles waged by the French and the Spanish impact the British position in Yorktown?
These dominoes that are set into effect by Galvez in the Gulf of Mexico pay off at Yorktown, because that fleet under Comte de Grasse fights the Battle of the Capes against the British fleet, defeats them, prevents Cornwallis from being reinforced or relieved from Yorktown, and he's trapped. Lafayette has him against the sea on three sides, and he's got no place to go, and the French control the mouth of the Chesapeake.
One of the famous stories from the siege at Yorktown takes place outside of Yorktown. Washington had deceived the British into thinking a major battle was going to be waged in New York City. So how long was Washington's army even able to move down to Yorktown before the British realized they'd been duped?
Washington's on his march for 10 days before the British figure out that he's not going to reposition the army. He's going somewhere else.
And that brings me to my next question. What even is a siege? Could you break that down for us?
A siege happens when one army has no place to run, or one army has been told to defend a specific objective until relieved. Well, in this case, Cornwallis had both. This was a siege because Cornwallis had been ordered to defend a deep water port, and he was surrounded by water on three sides, so he had no place to run. He had no outlet.
So then, as the Americans are fast approaching Yorktown, how are the British reacting? How are they going about fortifying their bases? What are they doing?
The British engineers, they basically used escaped slaves and British enlisted soldiers basically to pile dirt, and they didn't put any reinforcing material inside the dirt. When the American guns finally opened up, they were able to knock down that dirt very effectively without having any sort of skeleton inside the dirt. By the time the Americans rolled up, the British fortifications weren't even finished, and they had to hurriedly complete those, even though they'd had over 2 months to do the job.
Okay, so now we're here. The Americans have arrived. Rochambeau's arrived. What is the plan of attack?
Their objective at that point was to capture Cornwallis's army. What Washington decided to do was he decided to follow European siege tactics. The Americans began by forcing the British outer defenses back in. In fact, Cornwallis gave those up way too easily, knowing what was going to take place. So he pulled his outer defenses in. That gave the Americans the ability and the French the ability to create a circle around the perimeter of Yorktown. Once that circle was there, Washington spent days preparing his siege tools. And those tools were gabions and fascines. They spend days building these fascines and gabions before they begin to dig the first trench. And when they do, they dig it at the outside range of British guns, but a good range for the heavy siege guns that the French have brought with them to Yorktown.
Now I'm wondering how exactly the Americans were able to approach the British stronghold. How were they able to push through their outer defenses and get close to start the siege?
The men start to dig at about 10 o'clock at night, and by morning they've dug enough behind the line. They have set their gabions, they've set their fascines, they've covered them with this trench that they've dug behind there, and they are so far down that the British can't even see them as they're digging. the Americans and French start firing, and they knock down the British long-range guns, which the British don't really have very many. Once that communication trench is done, now they move in and they start to build the second line of trenches. And it's pretty much the same thing. They move in under the cover of darkness. They start digging. The British can hear them, but they can't really see them. There's firing, but it's inaccurate because they don't know exactly where they're digging. And in order for our second line of fortifications to extend all the way around to our right, the British left, we have to take readouts 9 and 10. The French attack readout number 9. The Americans are far more successful. They succeed with greater surprise on the attack of Redoubt 10.
So now let me ask, with the walls caving in and British defeat almost certain, what is Cornwallis thinking?
There's an overwhelming force that's going to come over the walls, and Cornwallis knows that. And so what he does is he attempts to escape. But as the British rowboats start out on the river, a thunderstorm appears out of nowhere, and the waves pile up to 8 feet tall in the York River, and the boats are swamped. Cornwallis has no other choice but to surrender.
It's become some sort of misconception that the siege of Yorktown actually ended the war, but it was really just the final major battle. Why exactly were smaller battles still waged for the next 2 years?
What is happening in that time is not so much open battles, but they're battles for control of territory. And the reason they want to do that is they want to have those territories as a bargaining chip at the peace talks. But we never talk about that in our history. We don't really understand that we were just a piece of this world war that erupts over our Declaration of Independence.
We've been speaking with Jim Gallagher, a historian and performer at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown. You can learn more about other events of the Revolutionary Age of America by visiting WHRO.org/USA250. For WHRO Public Media, I'm Connor Worley.